Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you in class today. Today's class is all about the separation of powers. We're going to look at this deeply, where the ideas have come from, how it works, why it's set up the way it is, and then go through a whole bunch of different stories and cases about how it's been tested over time. So this is a really interesting class, and we think one of a great one to bring at the end of the school year, because then over the summer, you'll be able to watch the government in action, watch how they push and pull each other, and understand that this was meant to be, that it's a part of the mixture, it's a part of the recipe. My name is Curry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. Please, as we go through class, ask lots of questions in the Q&A or the chat. And I'm here with Nicholas Mosvik. He's one of our top scholars at the center, and we're going to dive in deep. Excited to get going, Nicholas?
I am always excited to talk. So
he is. Now let's go. Big overview. So really quickly, we're going to jump through the separation of powers and the checks and balances definition, then get into maybe like a pre-founding story about where the ideas came from and how they influenced the founders of the United States, and then dive into bank veto and other modern cases. So we have a lot to cover. Nicholas, would you like to start with the kind of laying out the three branches or the definitions? Your choice.
I think let's do it how we did it at noon, because I mean, unless you feel differently,
No,
I think
I'm cool
that
either
worked.
way.
I think that worked well. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our terms, and then we're going to use three branches to give you some examples to point out how these look in action. So what do we mean by separation of powers, checks and balances in mixed government? Because they're important terms. They work together, but they also are distinct. So by separation of powers, we're talking about the division of power between the three branches of the federal and national government. And as we'll talk about at the end, state governments also have separation of powers in their constitutions. And it's the principle that no branch should improperly take power from another branch. So the reason that's important is we'll talk about, especially of James Madison, it doesn't mean an absolute wall, right? The boundaries are not that strict, right? But it's improper taking. What does that mean? We'll get to that. Checks and balances, we are talking about the mixing of powers, right? Such that one branch can check others from getting too powerful or prevent the centralization of authority in a single branch, right? So the idea here is you need some mixing of powers, not strict separation, in order to ensure one branch doesn't get too powerful, that you don't have tyranny in government. So what does that look like in practice? So let's go to our little handy three branches chart.
Yeah, and I love this graphic for a couple reasons. One, because it clearly defines each branch, but at the same time shows the interconnectedness. So,
Right.
Our goal of a healthy and vibrant democracy is almost to keep that center point pretty close to the center. And so it doesn't go too far in one direction or the other. So walk us through the three branches, walk us through their overlapping roles and connected, and then walk us through how they make sure the other one doesn't get too out of it, and then pull them back into the center.
It makes me think we should add a Venn diagram.
Oh, I've always wanted, yeah, Venn diagram
yeah,
with like a moving.
It would show you, but this is the deliberation is the term, right? Madisonian, where this is James Madison's show, because we'll be talking about him a lot because he thought about this a lot. But yes, we have mixing, and let's start with Article 1, right? We say Congress makes laws. That's its central job. Article 1 lays that out, right? It lays out the responsibilities, the powers in the process, which is important. But there is a role for the other branches, right? So Congress has to make the laws, right? They pass them. How do they pass them? Well, for instance, once both houses of Congress pass a bill, it's presented to the president, right? That's in Article 1, Section 7. Then the president from there decides whether to sign the bill, which makes it a law, or to veto it, or they could send it back to Congress. And if it lapses for 10 days, it's a pocket veto, right? It dies because the president didn't act. So the president gets a role in making laws, right? The president doesn't have committees, right? That doesn't do all that Article 1 process, committee markup, working between the houses. For instance, the House has to start all bills that deal with taxation or spending, right? That's really important. The appropriations, in other words, have to start in the House. but the president gets that role. And then, of course, Article 3, right? The judicial branch gets a role too. Yeah, okay, it passed. President signed it, maybe, but now the judiciary gets a role in saying whether or not it's constitutional. That is the mixing, right, of those powers. That's that checks and balances. So the separation of powers is only Congress makes the laws, right? Only the House gets to start with appropriations. As we'll talk about with the Senate, we'll get to some of those differences, but that's separation of powers, but then there's that mixing, right? So Article 2 gives us some great examples too, right? Curry just showed you one of those, and I think the next one, which is, okay, the Senate gets a role in treaty making and appointments, right? What does that mean? Well, the president starts, right? Separation of powers means the president plays the primary role in foreign policy, right? The president goes and negotiates with foreign heads of states. They draft up the treaties along with members of the executive, but then the Senate gets to approve any treaties by 2/3 majorities. Similarly, the president alone nominates cabinet members, right? Officers of the executive branch, and then nominees for the judicial branch. But the Senate gets to confirm, right? That's advice and consent. So you see there's the separation of powers. Okay, the president chooses, but then that sharing of power is the Senate gets a say. They get a check, right? So hopefully that gives kind of a sense of what we mean by these different things. Mixed government, we talked about at the new hour. This is an important concept because it sounds like the mixing of powers we just talked about, but it is actually a different idea, right?
Let's kind of like wrap this section up, and then we'll dive into like where did some of these ideas come from? Because I think when we talk about mixed governments, it's really like this bubbling up of ideas and how Madison takes some ideas, pulls others, but is reading these great classic stories and examples to be able to say, how am I going to take these brilliant ideas, some that worked and some that didn't work, and rejigger them in a way to make them so much better for us? And then what was his driving force? Like, he's trying to do all this. Why? What was the energy behind all that? So real quickly, just to wrap up, separation of powers, everybody has their own job, own distinct job, but then the other branches overlap with them to almost complete that job. And that is considered the separation of powers with the checks and balances. And now we get into why. Why did they make it this complicated? Because it really is. It's super interesting, but it's also super complicated. So let's talk about like mixing governments and starting about like where were their examples coming from to just start with what kind of government should we have?
Yeah, and that last question is kind of where the mixed government question is coming in, and that's important to take it on its own because yes, Madison and others, other founders were looking back to Aristotle and the Greeks and the Romans, and Aristotle's idea is there's three primary forms of government, right? And those forms are aristocracy, democracy or popular government, and monarchy. The idea of mixed government was that Aristotle essentially said, well, any of those three forms can devolve into tyranny, and for different reasons. So the preference for mixed government is to mix those forms in order to balance them, because you don't just want to have pure democracy. You don't want just monarchy with all the power unbalanced, because it will lead to tyranny. That was the lesson, right? So then the question is, how do you mix those forms into a representative government in a way that works best, right? That's what Madison was dealing with, right? And when we put into practice, when we see separation of powers, that's things like the Senate having a role in treaty making and appointments, because the point there was aristocracy would suggest, let's have one, but not both branches of the legislature have a role in certain things that have to do with the prerogative power, which is to say, formerly the power of just monarchies, right? That's mixed governments again, right? Because monarchies used to be, okay, the king has certain powers just in and of himself or herself, right? Those are prerogative powers. Now in our version, that's mixed across the branches, right? Where the old king powers go, some of the parliament powers of parliamentary supremacy or old democracies, they're mixed throughout the different branches. So that's really what we're talking about, right? So they're related terms, but this concept is also different. And it is an example of learning from the ancients. But as you suggested, there's a translation, right?
Yeah.
So some of the influences are more recent, right? That they're looking to Locke, they're looking to Montesquieu, Baron von Montesquieu. And what Montesquieu, who wrote in 1748, right, which is not that far away from the Revolution and the writing of the Constitution, right? I'm talking about 39 years prior to the drafting of the Constitution. So that's pretty recent. And Montesquieu was talking about strict separation of powers, right? He was saying liberty only is protected when there's strict separations. Otherwise, branches will work together and they will create tyranny, right? They will threaten liberty. And so we need to have strict separation of powers for that reason.
Now, when, there's a saying by Ben Franklin, and this is what Ben Franklin, he never would do a patent. He said that if you do a patent towards something, then people can't take your idea and make it better. And so this is what I always think of when Madison's looking at Montesquieu, looking at, Locke, looking at all these ideas. He is really trying to think of all the different pieces that they can add and say, what is the best? But what fell apart, and how can I use another great thing to add?
That's the key, right? It was what happens in between 748 and 1787. Yes. What's the answer, Curry? It's that state. We always say, state constitution. The reason they matter here is that, exactly. Madison thinks it's a failure, right? He says, look at Vermont, look at this other state that said, we're following Montesquieu. We put into our text strict separation, right? Read that. Shall be separate and distinct. Neither exercise the powers properly belonging to the other, right? That's strict separation. What Madison said is that didn't really work. I mean, part of it was that a lot of these states really focused on legislative supremacy, right? Some of them didn't even have a judiciary. They didn't have a real executive, or they had an executive council. But Madison's point was those states failed, right? And part of the reason was text alone wasn't enough to Madison, right? If you just put strict separations in there, that's not enough. Now, the Bill of Rights did have a version of this, but it got struck down. And that was also because other Federalists thought, this doesn't work in terms of just putting in the text, right? That's not enough. The reason for Madison was, look at people, right? What are the incentives of people? We can't rely on virtue alone. It's not because virtue isn't important. It's because that's not enough, right? We know that there are self-serving, I'm sorry, I'm looking for the A word of, I'm missing my part. Ambitious, and
this is what I think is like
avaricious. Avaricious men, right? They would be the threat, right? Because in a normal system, in an old system, they would lead to tyranny because the system was designed to, let's have virtue and we'll do best for public representation. Madison saying, well, no, we got to flip that, okay? Because the text limitation isn't enough. What we need to do is assume that we're going to have self-serving people, that we're going to have ambitious people. If he says, as he says in Federalist 51, famously, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That's the checks and balances, right? Yes, we need separation of powers to prevent liberty, but we also need the branches to compete. That's that battle of the branches that we have in our title, right? Is Madison's whole point is assume that and let it work for the benefit of all, right? Because we know that that's going to happen.
So, this is like a little bit of human theory mixed with a whole bunch of government theory. So this idea that you're innately going to get people, or people will innately become too powerful and too greedy for power. Therefore, if you create a structure that is forced to, and I know we like to call it democratic deliberation, but sometimes it's colliding. Sometimes it's colliding a little bit more. And that sounds too soft, or too sweet. Sometimes it's collision, and that's a good thing. So that's why we thought it was really important to name this after Madison's line of battles of the branches, because that's the way you can check each other. So when we talk about the separation of powers and that the checks and balances are guardrails, I always think if it's a little bit more like a ice hockey game than it is just, a badminton game. There's a little bit harder checks.
There's some checks.
Real Canadian ice hockey. Now, Warren would like you to take just
I saw Brazeau and Locke. Yeah. But in fairness,
in
the briefing document, we do mention Locke. It's a smart question because generally speaking, it's not just Montesquieu. Montesquieu is important because he, as I suggested, he's closest and time to the founding generation. But if you, for instance, if you go listen last week, we just had an event, a town hall on the Founders Library, and we're going to do this project. We're going to put all this up there. So Locke will be part of that. Rousseau will be part of that. The Scottish Enlightenment figures will be part of it. John Adams is important too, his thoughts on government. In other words, the answer for Warren is there is a lot of influences here. So we're, in some ways, we're just kind of focusing on Montesquieu and Madison because that's a key innovation, right? Madison is innovating in learning from both the ancients and the Enlightenment theory. So Locke is really important. There's no way to underscore that, right? Is that Locke's thoughts on government, his treatises, as well as his moral theory and his theory of language, they're all important, right? Locke's immensely important. Rousseau's social contract theory is important as well because Locke and Rousseau have different versions of the social contract theory. And yes, those ideas of social contract and popular government and popular sovereignty, all of those have something to do with separation of powers, because that notion is that the structure of government, the social contract you make with the people, must be kept. How do we keep it, right? Separation of powers has something to do with that, because if you have a branch that gets too powerful or bestows more power upon itself, it is working against that contract, right?
Yep.
So yes, I mean,
nice job there, Nicholas.
That's all important, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very good job. That was great. So. Warren agreed. That was a really good weave there. We were really impressed.
Now, I did it in 2 minutes too. You know how tempted I get. You say John Locke, and it's like we could go down that rabbit hole, but we have to avoid it.
You did a great dive and back out.
You know why? Because we want to get to the next part.
Yeah, because I love this story when the battles do get a little rough. You got to bring in Andrew Jackson. It's a great story. So why don't you tell us about it? And it's called the Bank War. It's not called the Bank Deliberation. It's the Bank War. So because
the stakes were high, right? The stakes
were high, and like the feelings and the emotions were pretty high too.
Yeah, which is there's several things going on here, right? And I think one of them is the legacy of the Marshall Court, right? That Andrew Jackson, as we'll see in his bank veto, he makes it clear that Andrew Jackson and his followers think that John Marshall and the court got it wrong many times, including in McCulloch versus Maryland. They still think the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional. Now, the reminder here is this is the second national bank that the Supreme Court upheld, because the first was chartered for 25 years. It was rechartered in 1816 for 20 years. So it's basically its contract was eventually going to come up. Now, the war didn't need to happen in 1832. They could have waited 4 years. But Jackson's opponents and the president of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, who was Philadelphian, they thought they had it right? They were pretty confident, like, okay, we can make this happen. We can pass the rechartering now. Everyone will do this. We know the bank's a good idea. But they didn't expect Andrew Jackson to veto it. And he did veto it in July of 1832. And I see what Warren says. We'll get to that part. I'll tailor that in at the end. But what does Jackson's veto says? Well, we have this nice quote here, right? The national bank is unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive of the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. But that's not just it, right? He says that, so he's saying it's unconstitutional in the first place. And it's odious. That's the word he uses. These are old terms that people would have recognized. He also rejects judicial supremacy. He thinks that both Congress and the president had a duty to independently consider the constitutionality of the bank. He says, look, advocates for the bank say the Supreme Court settled this, right? They made their decision and they made it 13 years ago. It's over. Jackson says, I cannot assent to this conclusion. Mere precedent is a dangerous source of authority. It should not be regarded as deciding questions of constitutional power, except where the acquiescence of the people in the states can be considered as well settled. In other words, the people haven't spoken and said that it's settled. The states haven't settled it. And Congress and the president haven't weighed in. And he thinks that needs to happen. He says the Congress, the executive, and the court must each for itself be guided by its own opinion of the Constitution, because each public officer who takes an oath to support the Constitution swears they will uphold it. And that's in Article 6, right? That's the oath. So he says they take an oath, they need to decide. And Jackson says, I did so, and I concluded that what McCulloch meant was that it is the exclusive province of Congress and the president to decide whether the particular features of the act are necessary and proper. In other words, he looked at it and he said it is not. It is unnecessary and improper. It is unconstitutional. Therefore, I'm vetoing it. That's Jackson's argument. How does that tie into Warren's question about the Trail of Tears and Indian relocation? Well, that was a Supreme Court decision. There were several of them in 1830 and 1832 in particular. There's a Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and then there's Worcester versus Georgia, and they're related decisions. There's an apocryphal statement of Jackson in which he says, essentially, Chief Justice Marshall, you enforce your decision. We don't know whether or not he said that. Some historians say he probably did. The reason it's apocryphal is that if Marshall didn't say, if Jackson didn't say it, he certainly would have wanted to say it because his attitude was certainly one of, yes, I know the Supreme Court made a decision. That's not the end. What's worth noting, too, that's interesting, Curry, is that Abraham Lincoln, almost 3 decades later, will make a very similar argument in a very different case. And that's Dred Scott.
Didn't Jackson appoint Lincoln to his postmaster general? Or
he did.
He did. There's all these connections between Lincoln and Taney and Jackson. It really, I mean, I know.
Yep.
Because, yeah, it's just kind of fascinating to look at that. Now, jumping to kind of the next lineup of cases that are just really great tests or examples of these checks and balances in actions. I think it would be awesome if we could do
Sick
the Sick Chickens
yep.
and the Youngsford Steel. I really find these
all
two
right, so
great.
That's a couple minutes for
chickens.
each. So let's start with the Sick Chickens. Okay, so we're talking New Deal, right? So now we've got in the future approximately 100 years. And now we're talking about FDR and the New Deal, and it's 1935. What is the Sick Chickens case? Okay, so Congress had passed what was called the National Industrial Recovery Act as part of the New Deal. Part of that act had created these what were called price and wage fixing mechanisms. That is price controls and wage controls, meaning for individual workers, right? Concerning the sale of whole chickens, including sick ones. That's why it became known as the Sick Chickens case, as well as maximum hour limitations and protections for the right to unionize. So this was all in there. And what it did is it gave the president and the executive branch the power to create what were called codes of fair competition. The Supreme Court struck that down. So they struck down this power to create codes of fair competition under separation of powers because they said that this it exceeded the limitations both of the Commerce Clause powers in Article 1, but also the reserved powers of states and the separation of powers between the president and Congress. In other words, Congress couldn't have gave this power to create these codes to Article 2, to the executive branch, because they were legislation. And even part of that legislation, they arguably didn't have the right to do. This was an improved code that had regulated hours, wages, trade and labor provisions, all these types of things. And essentially what the court said, this was Chief Justice Hughes, and he said, extraordinary conditions may call for extraordinary remedies, meaning the Great Depression. But the argument necessarily stops short of an attempt to justify action which lies outside the sphere of constitutional authority. Extraordinary conditions do not create or enlarge constitutional power. So that was the argument of the court. Essentially, it was, look, Congress gave too much power, more than it could of its own legislative authority, to the executive branch. They can't do that. It was in many ways a signal to try again, which they did in 1936, and that would actually be upheld by the Supreme Court later. That would be the FLMA, the Federal Labor Management Act.
What I think is so interesting about this case is, you know, they're spelling out, like, great, this is in time of great crisis, we understand, but you have to hold on to the structure we have set up. You cannot weaken it, because it's set up for so many really important reasons. I find this case fascinating because as you look at more current cases, what are the theories behind this case and how does it apply to that? Why do we want to keep that appropriate balance of structure in the branches? Because it's almost like a teeter-totter on a pin. And so you want to be able to keep that balance so it works together and doesn't just tip over to one side or the other, which is
if you look at that quote,
thick chickens.
and you're showing those branches, you look at that quote from Charles Evan Hughes, and that's just it, right? It's the essential functions and the vested powers. Making laws, executing laws, that's what we're talking about. Essential functions, vested powers, right? In other words, you can't give away the legislative power itself.
Yeah, you can't
right?
give it away your job.
You can do a lot to share powers, but you can't do that, right? That's okay. Sounds a little like meatloaf, I know, but you can't do that, right? That's kind of what it is.
No,
right?
I hear it. No,
you understand what I mean, right?
Yeah, so, again, he's talking about the band Meatloaf people, yes, not the food.
Yes, this is true. This is true. Although that is some sort of sharing, I'm sure.
Yes, I was like, Youngstown, it might actually work. Okay, next one.
Warren's asking about Chevron. We'll see if we can get there.
Yeah, I was going to say, Warren, we're not getting to that one yet.
Yeah, so this is the Steel Seizure case. The big deal here, right, is the quick summary is we're talking about the Korean War, right? So this is, the Korean War is roughly 1950 to 1953. President Truman, this is an undeclared war, so Congress has not declared war in Korea. It was a defensive action initially, and then troops were sent in by Truman. And essentially, he shuts down, or there's a shutdown of steel manufacturing because there's a labor strike, right? There's a labor dispute. And what Truman does is he orders his Secretary of Labor to seize the steel mills, right? To get them going again. And he does so on the basis of the need for war material. You see this quote here, right? Is the materials are needed for the war effort. They are produced to a great extent in this country, and steel is an indispensable component of substantially all of such weapons and material, right? So that was the claim, is that's why we need it. And the defense was, this is Article 2, right? This is the executive authority, right? As commander in chief was what they pointed to. The president's lawyers, I can do this. So what did the Supreme Court say? It's a 6-3 decision. They said no, right? Cannot do that. So there's more than one opinion here. We're showing you Justice Black first. Justice Black really focused on separation of powers, and it sounds a little more like the chickens case, right, Curry? It's mostly, look, this is a legislative action, right? Dealing with labor relations, that's something Congress does, right? They just passed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, one of the biggest congressional actions on labor management relations in the history of the United States, right? That's what Congress does, right? So he's saying, President's power, it's got to either stem from an act of Congress or the Constitution itself, right? There's no statute that authorizes the president to do this, right? Congress didn't do that. There's no authority to Congress, and you can't find it in Article 2 is what he's saying, right? So there's no independent authority. There's no law giving this. Therefore, the president can't do that. Now, Justice Jackson concurs. That means he agrees, but he gives separate reasons, right? What he says is, okay, there's 3 zones of authority, right? So everyone likes this because the zones of authority, right? Is okay. The first one is Congress acts, and there's Article 2 power, right? That's the ultimate authority for the president, in other words, right? Is both are working together, right? The second is that zone of twilight, right? They might have concurrent authority. They might be battling for authority. And therefore, in that case, it rests on, it has to rest on Article 2 alone, right? So we have to find it there. And what happens third, if the president takes measures that go against the implied or express will of Congress, that is, if Congress acted or suggested that the president couldn't do this, then the president's power is at its lowest ebb, right? What Jackson thought is this was that case. He thought in Taft-Hartley and previously, Truman has asked for this authority. Congress didn't give it to him. They laid down rules already just a couple years ago for labor relations. This power wasn't given to the president. That's evidence that it's in that third zone, and therefore, the president can't do this, right?
Okay.
And so the dissenters, by the way, they were saying, right, it's basically, no, it's Article 2, Commander in Chief. President can't do this. That's the dispute.
That's kind of Denise's question here. And so the reason why I love this is, it breaks down really clearly. And the court says, when they work together, they are much more powerful. The two different branches, when they work together, they're much more powerful to move things forward. When they work in opposition, they're far less powerful. Denise's question in here is, please explain how executive orders works into the distribution of powers. And it's been used more recently in current times. So how does that play into this separation of powers and checks and balances?
Yeah, so there will be even a case that should come down in the next year, because now it's under the Biden administration, and it was under the Trump administration. That was the border wall case. That question was, what if the president, by executive order, takes funds allocated for something else and uses them for a project that Congress suggested it didn't want to allocate funds for? Is that a separation of powers problem, right? Because the expenditure is there, Congress has approved the appropriation, and now the president says, as a matter of executive authority, I execute the law, so I decide how to spend from there once it's been appropriated. So that's a separation of powers problem, right? Because that's that argument as well. Congress decides what appropriations are used for. The president just carries that out, right? That's like an order to the president. And the president's argument is, no, I get to interpret, and I get to have some say at what's best, right? So you can see that that's a battle of the branches too. So the Supreme Court, they haven't decided that yet. They probably will still decide that that's an important question. But lower courts have suggested, no, the president can't do that. The Supreme Court had a related case years ago under the Obama administration that had to do with Obamacare. That was also, can the president separately essentially choose how to appropriate certain funds? And the Supreme Court has suggested no. That's under executive orders, right? So that's an example of like where that can go in a place that the Supreme Court will say no. Generally speaking, an executive order, the idea there is, I'm commander in chief, I'm head of the executive branch, I take care that the laws are executed. That's all under Article 2. So as part of that, I get to give commands to the executive branch to do certain things, to carry out their obligations. And that includes things like the interpretation of laws, right? Especially to executive agencies, right? Agencies are created by Congress. They're given powers of interpretive authority, essentially. And then they do things like rule making, right? Or they do agency actions as well, right? So the EPA comes out with a rule or it takes an action. That's an executive branch agency doing so based on authority they've been given by Congress. There could be a separation of powers problem if they did something that somebody thought was too excessive in terms of their authority or beyond what they did, right?
What about the opposite? What about Congress? And this is Denise's question. What if Congress passes a law, like to the EPA, and says like, okay, we want to do this, and the EPA does nothing? So not too far, but nothing. It reminds me of Jackson again, but like, has there been examples of the lack of action creating conflict and a check on the separation of powers, or a problem with the checks and balances, really?
I think there have been arguments like that before. I mean, certainly people have made arguments in the past that there are obligations that the government has that if they don't meet, they can be forced to be met, right? And the most recent context are things like environmental issues. But that goes both ways, to be clear, right? Because like the Clean Power Plan, for instance, was another great example of executive orders and clashes between the branches. Because the argument there was that was going beyond the authority of the EPA. That's something only Congress can do. Only Congress can pass an omnibus plan, basically, for dealing with environmental issues. But there's been lawsuits in the past. You can go back to Massachusetts versus EPA, in which that suit was basically, no, the EPA has to do something more because the Clean Air Act has certain demands in it for Congress saying the job here is to essentially ensure that we have clean air. What does that mean in terms of what the agency has to do? That argument there, they were saying, the Supreme Court was deciding whether or not Massachusetts could even make that argument. But the argument was essentially, they have to do this because we have to protect future generations. Is that a plausible legal argument? But you can see that the point there was they were actually saying the EPA has to do something more than they were doing.
So, question on that: could you then, if you were Congress and the EPA is not doing what do, could you take away their defund them as a check back? Like, you're not going to do what we tell you to do. We're going to do take away.
Congress can eliminate any of those agencies anytime it wants to.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out like how does the push and pull keep going?
They very rare. I don't even know the examples because there's some famous, analysis about the. It's hard to get rid of things essentially, right? Once they're created, it doesn't happen very often. But in theory, Congress could freely get rid of any agency. The argument against it in court would be something like vested rights. That's going to sound a slightly confusing, but the point would be, okay, an agency's been around for a long time. They've protected people in certain ways, right? For instance, say someone tried to get rid of Social Security. Yeah. And millions and thousands of people got together and said, yeah, but I've been relying on that for years and years. And I've been, I've had certain economic interests protect that way. There would probably be a suit. It would be on the idea that it's basically you have a vested right or interest because it's been around and Congress created it for the following purposes.
Fascinating. Awesome. Nicholas, thank you so much. This was a great class. It was really fun how
I don't know how we got to vested rights, but we did.
It's all right. It was great. I think everybody was really asking the different questions and then we kind of break it down and go from there. So thank you everybody for joining us for this great class on separation of powers and checks and balances, the battles of the branches. We are really excited that we will see you next September when our Monday classes resume, but this is our official last Monday class. So thank you all very much. Nicholas, thank you very much. And everybody, it was great to see you today.